I gave my son and his fiancée $85,000 to buy their dream house, then spent 3 years covering their bills while living in what they called the guest room. This morning, while I arranged flowers for their wedding, Sarah looked me in the eye and said, "The greatest gift you could give us is to just disappear from this family." By evening, her perfect wedding had become impossible, and my phone was ringing with desperate calls I chose not to answer. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I stood at Jack's kitchen counter, my weathered hands carefully arranging white roses and baby's breath into the centerpieces for tomorrow's wedding reception. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the dewdrops still clinging to the petals. Each flower needed to be positioned just right. I'd learned that much from Helen during our 43 years together. She always said flowers were like people. They needed patience and the right touch to show their beauty. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and something sweet Sarah had been baking since dawn. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to approach delicate work during my carpentry years, a few petals scattered across the granite counter as I adjusted a particularly stubborn stem. My fingers weren't as steady as they used to be, and the roses seemed to have minds of their own this morning. I brushed the fallen petals into my palm, not wanting to leave a mess in Sarah's pristine kitchen. The silence felt heavy around me, broken only by the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I could hear Sarah moving around upstairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in that quick, impatient rhythm I'd grown accustomed to. She'd been like this for weeks now, wound tight as a spring, checking and rechecking every detail for the wedding. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair already styled perfectly despite the early hour. She wore a crisp white blouse and dark jeans, her makeup flawless even though she'd supposedly just woken up. Her eyes immediately went to the flowers, then to the scattered petals on the counter. The smile she'd been wearing, probably from a phone call with one of her bridesmaids, faded as she took in the scene. I could feel her impatience radiating across the room like heat from a furnace. Her fingers drummed against the doorframe, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Mr. Miller," she said. "The florist said these arrangements needed to be perfect. The photographer will be taking close-ups of every table." She stepped closer, her designer perfume mixing with the scent of roses. I noticed how she always called me Mr. Miller, never Dad, never George. Just the formal distance that reminded me I was a guest in this house, not family. The morning light caught the massive engagement ring on her finger, the one Jack had spent 3 months' salary on. I nodded and continued working. "I'm being careful," I said quietly, adjusting another stem. "Helen taught me how to do this properly. These will look beautiful tomorrow." I meant it as reassurance, but I saw something flicker across Sarah's face at the mention of my late wife. She'd never met Helen, but I could tell she resented any reference to the woman who'd held this family together for so many years. Sarah crossed her arms, and I noticed the way her eyes tracked every movement of my hands, as if she was waiting for me to make another mistake. The kitchen felt smaller with her standing there, watching. That's when she said it. The words that would replay in my mind for days to come. "Mr. Miller, the greatest gift you could give us for our wedding is to just disappear from this family." Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as if she was discussing the weather or asking me to pass the salt. "You make everything harder, and Jack doesn't need the burden anymore." I kept my hands steady on the flowers, but inside, everything went very still. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the silence, and Jack appeared in the kitchen doorway. At 42, he still had the build of the high school quarterback he'd once been. though his dark hair was now streaked with premature gray. He wore his work clothes, khakis and a polo shirt with his company logo, and carried his coffee mug like a shield. His face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, realization, then something that looked almost like resignation. He'd heard what she said. I could see it in the way his shoulders sagged slightly. "Morning, Dad," he said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. He moved to the coffee maker, keeping his back to both of us, and I noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he refilled his mug. The silence stretched out, punctuated only by the clink of ceramic against the counter and the continued ticking of that damned clock. I wanted him to say something, anything, to contradict what Sarah had just told me. I wanted him to defend me, to remind her that I was his father, that I'd raised him alone after Helen died, that I'd given them everything I had. But Jack just stood there, staring into his coffee as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Sarah moved closer to Jack, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that looked casual, but felt calculated. "Jack, honey, we were just discussing tomorrow's arrangements," she said, her voice now sugary sweet, as if the conversation about my disappearance had never happened. He still wouldn't meet my eyes, and that silence told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties lay. Finally, Jack turned toward me, but his gaze landed somewhere around my shoulder rather than on my face. "Dad," he said, and I heard the careful control in his voice, the way he was measuring each word. "Sarah's been under a lot of stress with the wedding planning. You know how it is." He paused, took a sip of coffee, buying himself time. Maybe it would be best if you didn't show up tomorrow, just to keep things simple." This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to swing a hammer, to be a man. The boy I'd raised alone after Helen's cancer took her from us when he was 17. I looked between them, Sarah with her satisfied smile barely concealed, Jack with his guilty inability to meet my eyes. The kitchen felt like it was closing in around me, the familiar space suddenly foreign and hostile. I thought about the $85,000 from the sale of my house, the money that had made this place possible for them. I thought about the countless hours I'd spent helping Jack renovate this kitchen, installing the cabinets with my own hands, teaching him the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted me gone from the very house I'd helped them buy, unwelcome at the wedding I'd helped pay for. But I said nothing. Instead, I carefully set down the rose I'd been holding and wiped my hands on the dish towel. "I understand," I said quietly, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, probably wondering if I was going to make a scene, if I was going to fight back or break down. But I'd learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant knowing when to retreat. I folded the dish towel neatly and placed it on the counter next to the half-finished flower arrangements. I turned and walked toward the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet kitchen. As I climbed the stairs to what Jack had always called the guest room, never Dad's room, never my room, I felt each step like a nail being driven into a coffin. The wooden banister, smooth under my palm from years of my own sanding and staining, felt like a stranger's work now. At the top of the stairs, I paused and looked back down at the kitchen where Sarah was already rearranging my flowers, making them perfect in ways I apparently couldn't. Jack stood beside her, and from this angle, they looked like the perfect couple they'd always believed themselves to be. I didn't know then that this moment, this quiet retreat up the stairs, would be the last time I'd allow myself to be dismissed so easily. I opened the closet door and pulled out my old leather suitcase. The brass latches clicked open with the same sound they'd made for 30 years, back when Helen and I would pack for weekend trips to the lake. The room smelled faintly of lavender air freshener. Sarah's touch, not mine. Everything here was temporary, designed to remind me I was passing through rather than staying. The bed was made with hotel crisp corners, the dresser held only my few belongings, and even the family photos on the nightstand faced away from the bed, as if ashamed to look at me. I transferred clothes from dresser to suitcase, flannel shirts, work pants, the navy suit I'd worn to Helen's funeral, and kept for special occasions that seemed to come less and less often. The fabric felt thin between my fingers, worn soft from years of washing and wearing. I could hear movement downstairs, cabinet doors opening and closing, the clink of dishes being arranged, Sarah's heels tapping against the kitchen tiles, the sounds of a house preparing for celebration, for new beginnings, for futures that apparently didn't include me. I pressed my lips together and continued packing. Each item a small goodbye to the life I'd tried to build here. The voices drifted up from below, clearer now as they moved closer to the bottom of the stairs. Sarah's laugh rang out, bright and musical, the sound she made when she was truly pleased about something. Then her voice, carrying easily through the thin walls. "Once he's out, we can finally redo this room. Maybe a yoga studio or a home office for Jack." I sank onto the edge of the bed, still holding that sweater, and reached for the silver frame on the nightstand. Helen's face smiled back at me from behind the glass, her gray eyes warm with the kind of love that made everything else bearable. I traced the frame's edge with my thumb, feeling the small dent where I'd dropped it during the move from our old house. That house where we'd raised Jack. "Helen, they want me gone," I whispered to the photograph. "After all we gave them." The words felt strange in the empty room, but I needed to say them out loud, needed her to hear them somehow. I thought about the day Jack had called 3 years ago, his voice tight with worry about mortgage payments and property taxes. How Helen and I had looked at each other across our kitchen table and known without speaking what we had to do. We'd sold the house where Jack had learned to walk, where Helen had planted roses every spring, where 40 years of marriage had soaked into the very walls. And we'd given them everything. I placed the photograph carefully in the suitcase, wrapped in a clean undershirt to protect the glass. The voices downstairs had moved back toward the kitchen, but I could still make out Sarah's animated chatter about centerpieces and seating arrangements. She was in her element now, planning and organizing, making everything perfect for tomorrow's ceremony. I wondered if she'd even notice my absence, or if it would just be one less thing to worry about, one less complication in her flawless wedding day. The thought sat heavy in my chest, a weight I couldn't quite name, but couldn't shake either. I closed the suitcase with deliberate care, making sure the latches caught properly. 20 minutes later, I sat in my truck in the driveway, engine running, air conditioning fighting against the morning heat. The house looked peaceful from here, with its fresh white paint and the flower beds I'd helped Jack plant last spring. The wedding invitation on my dashboard, the one with my name carefully written in Sarah's perfect script, seemed to mock me now. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Linda Barnes. She'd handled the legal work when Helen and I bought our first house, and later when we'd sold it. "Linda, it's George Miller," I said when she answered. "George, how are you? How's the new living situation working out?" she said. I looked back at the house, watching Jack's shadow move past the kitchen window. "That's actually why I'm calling. I need to ask you something about the house sale. The $85,000 we gave Jack and Sarah, was that legally a gift?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. "Let me pull your file." "No, George, remember? We structured it as an investment to avoid gift tax implications. You're listed as owning 1/3 of the property. We discussed this specifically because of the amount involved. I felt something shift in my chest, like a door opening that I'd forgotten existed. So, I'm still a co-owner? Absolutely. Is there a problem? She said. I watched Sarah appear in the upstairs window, gesticulating excitedly as she talked on her phone. She held something white, her wedding dress probably, showing it off to friends or family. Her face was animated, glowing with joy and anticipation. The window framed her like a portrait of happiness, and for a moment I could see why Jack had fallen for her. Young, beautiful, full of energy and plans for the future. Everything I was not. "George, are you still there?" Linda said. "I'm here," I said, but I couldn't take my eyes off the window. Sarah had moved closer to the glass now, holding the dress up to herself, turning side to side to show off the silhouette. Even from this distance, I could see her laughing, probably describing the dress to whoever was on the other end of the call. The morning light caught the beading on the bodice, making it sparkle like stars. She looked radiant, triumphant, like a woman who'd gotten everything she'd ever wanted, like someone who'd never known a moment's real hardship or loss. "No immediate problem," I said finally. "Just wanted to clarify my legal position." "Well, you're definitely protected. Any major decisions about the property would require your consent as a co-owner," she said. I ended the call and continued watching the window. Sarah had disappeared, but I could still see movement inside, shadows crossing back and forth as she prepared for tomorrow. The house I'd helped buy, the wedding I'd helped fund, the future I'd helped make possible. And yet I was being erased from all of it, dismissed like an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. I started the truck and backed out of the driveway, taking one last look at the white house with its red front door. Sarah reappeared in the window, still on her phone, still laughing. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a text message from Jack. "Dad, the caterer needs the final head count. Should I tell them you're not coming?" The question mark felt like a knife twist. Even now, even after everything, he was asking me to make it easy for them, to save them the trouble of uninviting me, to disappear quietly and let them pretend I'd never been part of this family at all. I set the phone on the passenger seat without responding and drove toward the outskirts of town, where a motel sign promised clean rooms and no questions asked. What I didn't realize then was that my phone call to Linda had set something in motion that would change everything. And tomorrow's wedding was about to become impossible in ways none of us could imagine. The Sunset Motor Lodge sat at the edge of town like a forgotten afterthought, its neon sign flickering between pink and darkness in the afternoon heat. The clerk barely looked up from his magazine when I paid cash for 3 nights, sliding a brass key across the scratched counter without a word. Room 14 smelled of old cigarettes and industrial disinfectant, the kind of place where people came to disappear for reasons they didn't discuss. The bedspread was orange and brown, circa 1975, and the air conditioning unit rattled like loose change in a tin can. I set my suitcase on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the springs sag beneath me. The silence pressed against my ears after 3 years of living in Jack's house, with its constant background noise, Sarah's morning routine, the coffee maker's daily gurgle, the television always playing something. Here, there was only the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional car passing on the highway outside my window. I unwrapped the sandwich I'd bought at a gas station, processed turkey and cheese on white bread that tasted like cardboard. But I chewed methodically, swallowing each bite, because eating was what you did to stay alive, not because you enjoyed it. My phone vibrated against the nightstand. Jack's name flashed on the screen, and I could already hear the panic in his voice before I answered. "Dad, what did you do?" "They called me. The reception is canceled," he said. "You wanted me gone," I said. "I'm just honoring your wish." "What are you talking about? We need to fix this. The caterer, the venue, they're all asking questions about payments. Sarah's having a breakdown," he said. I finished the last bite of sandwich and crumpled the wrapper. Through the thin walls, I could hear a television playing a game show, the audience applause muffled but enthusiastic. Someone in the next room was living a louder life than mine. "Ask Sarah what gift she wanted from me. I'm sure she remembers," I said. "Dad, please, we can talk about this." "Come home," he said. Home. The word sat between us like a stone. I clicked off the phone and set it face down on the nightstand, next to the lamp with its crooked shade and the scratched glass ashtray that belonged to another era. I lay back on the bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere I'd never been. I reached for the small black notebook I'd kept in my shirt pocket for the past 3 years. Helen had always teased me about my record-keeping, calling me her human calculator, but the habit had served me well over the years. Numbers didn't lie, and they didn't hurt your feelings or ask you to disappear. I flipped to the first page, where I'd written Jack and Sarah in my careful block letters, and began reading through the entries I'd made in blue ink, month by month, year by year. The $85,000 from the house sale sat at the top of the first page, dated 3 years ago, followed by smaller amounts that had seemed insignificant at the time. $500 for Jack's car repair when his transmission died. $800 for Sarah's dental work when her insurance didn't cover the crown. $1,200 for the new refrigerator when theirs broke down the week before Christmas. Each entry was documented with dates and receipts, a careful accounting of money that had flowed from my savings account to theirs, like water running downhill. The amounts grew larger as time went on, as if my willingness to help had been mistaken for an endless resource. I turned the pages, running my finger down columns of figures that told the story of 3 years lived in careful financial balance. Wedding expenses appeared in the final months. $2,000 for the photographer, $1,500 for Sarah's dress, another $1,000 for flowers and decorations. The reception venue alone had cost $3,000, paid with a check I'd written after Jack called me, his voice tight with stress about credit card limits and payment deadlines. At the bottom of the page, I wrote the total in red ink, pressing hard enough that the pen nearly tore through the paper. $20,347, not including the house money. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of all those numbers, all those decisions made with love and hope and the belief that family meant something more than a financial arrangement. I thought about Helen, about how she'd saved every penny for 40 years so we could have something to leave behind for Jack. How we'd planned to travel, to see the ocean one more time, to visit her sister in Colorado. Instead, we'd sold our life and handed it over to 2 people who saw me as a burden to be eliminated. I wasn't just being cast out. I had been used. Used like a wallet that could be discarded once it was empty. Every conversation about money, every crisis that required my financial help, every grateful hug from Jack and polite thank you from Sarah. It had all been part of a long, slow process of extraction. They had mined me like a resource, taking everything I had to give while planning for the day when I would no longer be useful. I stood up and walked to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain to look out at the parking lot. A young couple was unloading suitcases from their car, laughing about something as they carried their bags toward the office. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had choices, who could come and go as they pleased. I envied them their mobility, their apparent freedom from the complicated mathematics of family obligation. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered, my face drawn and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. The notebook in my hand felt heavier now, loaded with the weight of documentation and proof. Tomorrow was supposed to be Jack's wedding day, the culmination of months of planning and thousands of dollars in expenses. Sarah's perfect day, orchestrated down to the last detail, funded by money from a man she wanted to disappear. I opened the notebook again and looked at those red numbers, thinking about Linda Barnes and property ownership, and the legal documents that said I owned 1/3 of the house where my son and his fiancée slept tonight. The numbers stared back at me, as cold and factual as mathematical equations. I picked up my phone and started making calls. First to Linda Barnes's emergency number, then to the bank, then to the caterer whose number I found on one of the receipts in my notebook. The people on the other end of the line asked questions I was prepared to answer, requested information I had ready to provide. By the time I finished, the sun had set outside my window, and the motel's neon sign had begun its nightly battle between light and darkness. My phone buzzed again. Another call from Jack, then a text from Sarah, then a voicemail I didn't bother to listen to. I turned the phone off and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand. Outside my window, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, and I wondered if some battles were about to require more than just financial documentation to resolve. The knock came at 7 in the morning. "Police, open up, please." I turned off the television and walked to the door, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. Through the peephole, I could see a uniformed officer, his patrol car parked directly in front of my room. He was young, maybe 30, with short-cropped hair and the kind of mustache that suggested he was trying to look older than his years. His hand rested casually on his utility belt, not threatening, but ready. Behind him, the parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck and a sedan with out-of-state plates. I unlatched the chain and opened the door, squinting against the brightness. "Mr. George Miller?" he said. "That's me," I said. "I'm Officer Rodriguez with the County Sheriff's Department. We received a report of elder abuse. Your family claims you might be declining mentally, making irrational financial decisions." He pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. "They're concerned about your well-being and asked us to conduct a welfare check." I stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. The officer entered slowly, his eyes taking in the sparse motel room, the unmade bed, my suitcase still open on the dresser, the empty sandwich wrapper on the nightstand. His gaze lingered on the black notebook I'd left open beside the television, its pages filled with my careful handwriting and columns of numbers. The air conditioning unit rattled to life, filling the silence between us with its mechanical wheeze. "Sir, can you tell me why you're staying here instead of at home?" he said. I walked to the dresser and picked up a manila folder I'd prepared the night before. Inside were photocopies of every document that mattered: the house sale contract showing my ownership percentage, bank transfer receipts, the wedding invoices with my name and signature, and 3 years' worth of financial records. I handed the folder to Officer Rodriguez and watched his eyebrows rise as he flipped through the pages. "The only abuse here is how they drain me while calling me useless," I said. "Yesterday, my son's fiancée told me the greatest gift I could give them was to disappear from their family, after I'd given them $85,000 and paid for their wedding." Officer Rodriguez closed the folder and looked at me with different eyes, not the careful assessment of a potentially confused elderly man, but the focused attention of someone recognizing a more complex situation. He set the folder on the small table by the window and pulled out a chair, gesturing for me to sit across from him. "Mr. Miller, these documents show substantial financial contributions on your part," he said. I told him everything. About Helen's death, about selling our house to help Jack and Sarah with their mortgage, about 3 years of additional expenses that had drained my savings account like a slow leak. I showed him my notebook with its careful accounting, explained how each crisis had required another check, another withdrawal, another piece of my financial security. The officer took notes in his own small pad, asking questions about dates and amounts, but mostly just listening as the story unfolded in the cramped motel room. "And yesterday, after being told you should disappear, you made some phone calls?" he said. "I exercised my legal rights as a property owner," I said. "The wedding venue, the caterer, the photographer, they all had contracts with clauses about property ownership disputes. When I informed them of my legal standing and requested cancellation, they complied." Officer Rodriguez nodded and closed his notebook. He stood up and walked to the window, pushing aside the curtain to look out at the parking lot. A housekeeping cart rattled past, pushed by a woman in a faded uniform who glanced curiously at the police car. The morning was heating up already, and I could see heat waves beginning to shimmer off the asphalt. "Mr. Miller, based on my assessment and the documentation you've provided, you're clearly competent to make your own financial and personal decisions," Officer Rodriguez said. He handed back my folder and tucked his notebook into his shirt pocket. "I'll be closing this case and filing a report that indicates no signs of mental decline or impairment. You're well within your rights to manage your property as you see fit." I walked him to the door, feeling something shift in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a kind of validation I hadn't realized I'd been craving. For 3 years, I'd been treated like a well-meaning but incompetent old man who needed guidance and management. Now, a neutral party had looked at the evidence and confirmed what I'd known all along. I was the victim here, not the problem. The officer paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe. "For what it's worth, sir, I've seen situations like this before. Family finances can get complicated, and sometimes people forget that generosity isn't the same as obligation," he said. "Thank you, officer," I said. I stepped out into the parking lot, tilting my face toward the cloudless sky. The asphalt was already hot beneath my feet, and the air shimmered with the promise of another blazing day. A mockingbird perched on the motel's flickering neon sign, cycling through a repertoire of borrowed songs with mechanical precision. I thought about Helen, about how she'd always said that sometimes you had to lose everything to figure out what you were really made of. She'd been talking about her cancer diagnosis at the time, but the words felt relevant now in ways she couldn't have foreseen. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message from Jack asking if we could work something out before lawyers got involved. I deleted the message without responding and walked back into the motel room, where my folder of documents waited on the table like a deck of cards I was finally ready to play. The numbers in my notebook told a story of exploitation, but they also told a story of power. Legal, financial, and moral power that I'd forgotten I possessed. I picked up my phone and dialed Linda Barnes' office number. When her secretary answered, I asked to schedule an emergency meeting for this afternoon. "Legal consultation," I said. "Property ownership dispute. The kind of meeting that would require a conference room and multiple copies of contracts, and probably some very uncomfortable conversations for people who'd grown accustomed to taking my compliance for granted." The secretary put me on hold, and I listened to classical music while watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam streaming through my window. When she came back on the line to confirm a 2 o'clock appointment, I thanked her and hung up. Then I walked to the dresser mirror and looked at myself, really looked for the first time in months. The man staring back was 70 years old, with gray hair and lines around his eyes, but his jaw was set with a determination that reminded me of the carpenter I'd once been. The man who'd built houses that lasted, who'd raised a son alone, who'd loved a woman through 43 years of marriage and stayed by her side until cancer took her away. Tomorrow would bring a conversation that would determine whether my son's wedding would ever happen and whether the house I'd helped buy would remain in their possession. But tonight, something else entirely was about to test just how far Jack and Sarah were willing to go to keep me silent. Linda Barnes's conference room smelled of leather and old coffee, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the courthouse square. The door opened at exactly 2 o'clock, and Jack entered first, his face drawn and pale in a way that made him look older than his 42 years. Behind him came Sarah, her usual perfect composure cracked like a foundation under pressure. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she clutched a small purse against her chest. They took seats across from me without making eye contact, the width of the table feeling like an ocean between us. Linda entered carrying a thick file and a yellow legal pad covered with her distinctive handwriting. She wore her gray hair pulled back severely, and her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the afternoon light as she settled into her chair at the head of the table. "Let's begin with the facts," Linda said. She opened the file and spread the house purchase contract across the table where all of us could see it. The document was 3 pages of legal language and signatures, but the relevant section was highlighted in yellow. My ownership of 33% of the property, clearly stated in black ink. George has legal standing as a co-owner of the property in question. Any major financial decisions regarding the house require his consent. Sarah's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I watched her chest rise and fall as she stared at the contract. Jack rubbed his temples with both hands, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to solve a math problem that seemed impossible. The weight of their situation was finally settling on them. "You either buy me out," I said, "or we sell the house." Sarah's composure shattered completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, carrying mascara in dark streaks that made her look younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Her voice rose to a near scream, raw with desperation and disbelief. "You'll ruin us. We'll be homeless. Our credit is maxed out. We can't get another mortgage, and you know it," she said. "You ruined this the moment you told me to disappear," I said. Jack's head snapped up, his eyes finally meeting mine for the first time since they'd entered the room. In his expression, I saw the boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, looking for someone to fix what was wrong. But I also saw the man who had stood in his kitchen yesterday and told me not to come to his wedding, who had chosen his fiancée's cruelty over his father's dignity. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Jack reached across to touch her arm, but she pulled away from him, lost in her own private catastrophe. I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the memory of her voice saying I should disappear, of her casual planning to turn my room into a yoga studio. "George," Jack said, and his voice cracked on my name. "Dad, please, we can work this out. We can find another way." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the fear in his eyes, the desperate calculation of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. This was the moment I'd been moving toward since yesterday morning, when Sarah's words had stripped away the last of my illusions about my place in their lives. Everything that happened next would depend on how much dignity they were willing to trade for financial survival. "There is another way," I said finally. Linda leaned forward, her pen poised over her legal pad. "But it comes with conditions." I reached into my folder and pulled out a sheet of paper I'd written by hand that morning in the motel room. Sarah lifted her head from her hands, her eyes red and swollen but suddenly focused with the sharp attention. "I'll reduce the buyout to $70,000, I said. The number was $15,000 less than my legal entitlement, but I watched their faces and saw that even this reduced amount felt impossible to them. But the money comes with requirements that aren't negotiable. Linda took the paper from my hands and read through my conditions, her eyebrows rising slightly at the thoroughness of what I'd outlined. Jack and Sarah leaned forward, trying to read the document upside down across the table, their heads nearly touching as they strained to see the terms that would define their future. "Sarah will get a full-time job within 30 days, I said. "No more living off wedding gifts and credit cards while someone else pays the bills." Sarah's mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound came out. I could see her calculating the implications. The loss of her comfortable lifestyle, the necessity of actually working for money instead of simply spending it. "You'll sell one of your cars and eliminate unnecessary expenses. No more spa appointments, no more shopping trips, no more dinners at restaurants you can't afford," I continued. "And you'll provide me with monthly financial reports showing every dollar that comes in and goes out." Jack's head was bowed so low I could see the gray roots in his hair where he'd been letting the expensive salon treatments lapse. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a resignation that aged him a decade in the span of a heartbeat. "The alternative is that we put the house on the market tomorrow," I said. "In which case, you get nothing, and I get my full third of whatever it sells for." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet of people standing at the edge of a cliff, calculating whether they had the courage to jump or the strength to climb back up. Sarah had stopped crying, her tears replaced by the hollow expression. Jack sat motionless, staring at the contract on the table, as if it might suddenly change into something more favorable. "We'll need time to find the money," Jack said finally. "You have 60 days, I said. "The agreement goes into effect immediately, and the first financial report is due in 30 days. "I'll need to draft formal documents," Linda said. "This agreement will be legally binding, with penalties for non-compliance that include immediate foreclosure proceedings." Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out thin and strained. "What about the wedding?" "The wedding is cancelled," I said. "The deposits are forfeit. You can have a ceremony when you can afford to pay for it yourselves." Sarah stared at me across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part hatred, part desperation, part something that might have been the beginning of respect. "We'll do it," Jack said. "We'll take the deal." Linda continued writing, documenting the terms that would govern their lives for the foreseeable future. The clock on the bookshelf chimed 4 times, marking the end of negotiations and the beginning of consequences that would ripple through all our lives in ways I was only just beginning to understand. The Sunset Manor. Apartments sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees that had been planted when the development was new 30 years ago. My 1-bedroom unit faced east, catching the morning light through windows that opened onto a small garden where other residents grew tomatoes and herbs in raised beds. The apartment came furnished with practical pieces: a blue recliner that fit my back perfectly, a dining table for 2, a bed with a firm mattress that didn't creak when I turned over in the night. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the carpet was new enough that it still smelled faintly of factory chemicals, rather than the accumulated odors of previous tenants. I spent my first week arranging Helen's things in places where they felt right. Her photograph on the nightstand, her china cabinet in the living room corner, her recipe box on the kitchen counter, even though I had no intention of cooking elaborate meals for one person. The silence was different here than it had been at Jack's house. This was my silence, chosen and paid for with money that was mine, in a space where no one could tell me I was unwelcome. The pool outside my window was small, but clean. and I watched elderly couples take their morning walks around the perimeter, their conversations carried on the breeze that rustled through the garden. 3 weeks after signing the lease, I was reading the newspaper in my recliner when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Jack's number, but when I answered, Sarah's voice came through the speaker. She sounded tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, as if the weight of working for the first time in years had settled into her bones and changed her from the inside out. "George, I got a job," she said. "Receptionist at a dental office. It's hard work, 8 hours on my feet, dealing with insurance and angry patients. But for once, I feel proud when I cash my paycheck." I sat still in my chair, the newspaper folded in my lap, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through my clean windows. The words hung between us like a bridge being built one plank at a time, fragile, but real. I could hear something in her voice that I'd never heard before. Not the desperate manipulation of someone who needed money, not the casual dismissal of someone who took everything for granted, but the quiet satisfaction of a person who'd earned something through their own effort. "That's good, Sarah," I said. "The first monthly report is in the mail," she said. "Everything documented, every expense accounted for. We sold my car last week, the BMW. Jack rides the bus to work now, and I walk to the dental office. It's only 6 blocks. The apartment was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard. Through my window, I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door watering her tomatoes with a green plastic can, moving slowly but steadily along her row of plants. "How are you doing?" Sarah said. The question surprised me. In 3 years of living in their house, she'd never asked about my well-being, except in the perfunctory way people ask about the weather. I looked around my small apartment, at Helen's photograph smiling from the nightstand, at the stack of library books on the coffee table, at the crossword puzzle I'd been working on before the phone rang. The space was smaller than what I'd had before, but it was mine in a way that Jack's house had never been. "I'm fine," I said. "Better than fine." The invitation came 2 months later, delivered in Sarah's careful handwriting on a note card that had probably come from a dollar store rather than the expensive stationery she'd once favored. "Would you like to come for dinner Sunday evening? Nothing fancy, just spaghetti." The address was for a small apartment complex on the other side of town, the kind of place where young couples started out and older people landed when their circumstances changed unexpectedly. I folded the note and tucked it into my shirt pocket, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not just a meal, but an acknowledgement that I was someone worth inviting. Sunday evening arrived gray and cool, with the first hint of autumn in the air that made me reach for a light jacket. The apartment complex was older than mine, with external staircases and doors that opened directly onto covered walkways. Unit 2B was on the 2nd floor, and I climbed the concrete steps slowly, my hand sliding along the metal railing that was painted green, but showed rust at the joints. Through the windows, I could see other families gathered around dinner tables, their lives illuminated in warm rectangles against the darkening sky. Jack answered the door wearing jeans and a flannel shirt I remembered buying him for Christmas 5 years ago. His hair was longer than he'd worn it in years, and I could see gray stubble on his jaw that suggested he'd given up his expensive shaving routine. But his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months, and when he stepped aside to let me in, his gesture felt genuine rather than obligatory. "Dad," he said, "thanks for coming." The apartment was small but clean, with furniture that looked like it had come from garage sales and thrift stores. A card table covered with a white tablecloth served as the dining room, set with mismatched plates and silverware that gleamed from recent washing. The air smelled of tomato sauce and garlic, Simple scents that reminded me of Helen's kitchen when money was tight, and we made do with whatever we had. Sarah emerged from the tiny kitchen wearing an apron I didn't recognize, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her face flushed from cooking over a hot stove. No flowers decorated the table, no candles flickered in crystal holders, no music played softly from hidden speakers. Just the smell of tomato sauce simmering in a pot and the sound of water boiling for pasta. Jack moved around the small space with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than choice, checking the stove and stirring the sauce, while Sarah drained the pasta in a plastic colander. I sat down at the card table and watched them work together, and for a moment I could see past the adults they'd become to glimpse the young couple who'd once been grateful for my help, rather than entitled to it. "The sauce is from a jar," Sarah said as she carried the pot to the table. "I'm still learning to cook real meals. The dental office is too busy for me to spend hours in the kitchen anymore." I served myself pasta and sauce, noting how Sarah portioned out the food carefully, making sure there was enough for everyone without waste. Jack sat across from me and began cutting his spaghetti with his fork and knife, the way I'd taught him when he was 7 years old and struggling with the mechanics of eating like a grown-up. The memory hit me with unexpected force. That little boy at our kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to master the coordination required to wind pasta around his fork. "I remember teaching you that," I said. Jack looked up from his plate, pasta sauce at the corner of his mouth. "You taught me a lot of things. How to cut wood, how to use a level, how to check if a corner was square. I use those skills at work now, training new guys on the construction crew." The conversation continued quietly over our simple meal, touching on safe subjects like work and weather and the changing season. But underneath the surface pleasantries, I could feel something shifting between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. They were learning to live within their means, to work for what they wanted, to find satisfaction in small accomplishments rather than large indulgences. And I was learning that setting boundaries didn't mean cutting off love, that demanding respect didn't require destroying relationships. When the meal was finished, Jack cleared the table while Sarah made coffee in a pot that had seen better days. I sat in my chair and looked around the small apartment, noting the absence of the luxury items that had once defined their lifestyle. No expensive artwork, no designer furniture, no gadgets that cost more than some people made in a month. But there was something here that had been missing from their beautiful house. A sense of genuine contentment, of people who were building something real rather than maintaining an illusion. As I prepared to leave, Sarah walked me to the door. In the porch light, she looked younger than her years, but also older, as if experience had both worn her down and built her up in equal measure. She stood with her arms crossed against the evening chill, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed to be searching for words rather than having them ready-made. "Thank you for coming," she said. "And thank you for making us face reality. I know you didn't have to give us any options at all." I nodded and started down the concrete steps, my hand trailing along the rusted railing. Behind me, I heard the door close and the sound of deadbolts turning, not the electronic locks of their former house, but simple hardware that required actual keys. As I walked to my car, I realized that something fundamental had changed tonight. Something that went deeper than financial arrangements or legal contracts. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to disappear from situations that diminish us, only to reappear as the person we were always meant to be. If this story touched you, If you've ever felt invisible in your own life or questioned your worth in relationships that should nurture you, remember George's journey. Remember that respect isn't negotiable, that boundaries aren't walls but doorways, and that sometimes love means teaching people how to value what they've taken for granted. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't measured by what they give, but by who they choose to become when they finally choose themselves.